Welcome to Negotiation with Alice, your negotiation podcast. Everything that you do where you need to get on the same page with someone else is a negotiation. So whether you have to negotiate a contract with someone, or you simply need your boss to sign off on that program that you'd like to implement, or you want to figure out how to rebalance the chore structure in your home, or talk about what vacation you want to go on. All of these things are negotiations. So in my podcast, we go over both personal and professional conversations, which all are considered negotiation, and I will give you tips on how to come out ahead. Welcome to the show. Welcome, listeners, to another episode of Negotiation with Alice. Today, I've got Ellen Kim with us today, and actually, Ellen is a mediator like I am, but I'm going to go ahead and let Ellen introduce herself. Welcome, Ellen.
Thanks so much, Alice. Hi, everybody. My name is Ellen. I am a corporate attorney at Workday. I work closely with the sales organization to close deals. So I'm also in the trenches doing negotiations just like Alice. I am also a mediator, and on the side, I'm also a career design coach. So I help graduate business students at Santa Clara University negotiate what their next is going to be. And I think the theme in all of my conversations is I love being at the inflection point, critical conversations. So this is another one. This is another conversation that I'm so excited to have.
Yes, I'm very excited as well. And I think Ellen has brought up a very interesting topic for us to chat about today because it's something that I actually have not spoken about on this podcast so far. And that's quite a feat considering we're getting close to 80 episodes. So,
well, Ellen, worst time for everything, right, Alice?
Exactly. So, yeah, Ellen, what's the topic that you'd like to discuss today?
So Alice, the topic I'd like to discuss today is negotiations or just communications in high context relationships versus lower context relationships. And what I mean by that is when we're in high context relationships in certain cultures, there's definitely much more of a premium on implicit communications, an understanding where there's nonverbal cues, there's shared history, there's a lot of unspoken expectations, as well as a huge emphasis on relationships, right? And everything is very much context specific. And that's in contrast to other communications or lower context communications where there isn't, embedded relationships and dynamics that need to come into play immediately. And therefore communications can be a lot more direct. So I just spewed a whole bunch on you, and I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts even before I even get to asking the question. But I don't know, what are your immediate thoughts, Alice? I know you have plenty in this space.
Yeah, I would say, if you're going to be in a negotiation where there is a different culture, where potentially there might be high context going on, the most important thing really is to be prepared. To prepare yourself by learning about the culture, learning about what things can be offensive to the other person, that sort of thing. This is an example, and it's a slightly different example, but an example nevertheless. One of the things that I teach, and I'm sure you do as well, Ellen, when it comes to negotiation, is you always ask, because you can't get anything if you don't ask. However, in my family, in the high context relationship that we have with my immigrant parents who are from Japan, asking was offensive. So if you ask, you're shut down, and not only are you shut down, you get punished. So you actually become in the negative, right? Because in America, it's oh, we'll just ask, because if the answer is no, you just go back to neutral, which is where you are today. But when I was growing up, it was don't ask, because if you ask, you're going to get there's punitive measures taken if you ask. Right, and that it was in our family, that was high context. It was sort of understood. So in the same sense, if you're going into negotiations with another culture, you kind of need to understand what things could be taken as offensive. I know in the Black community, it is not okay to be calling people by their first name. Right, you're going to say Mr. or Mrs. and their last name. Because you can offend someone if they're older than you and you call them by their first name.
So there's so much there. But one thing I just want to note is maybe in some of the Asian cultures, when there is silence, it is not lack of engagement, but it's actually an understanding of multi-levels of deference, respectful of authority, understanding that if you ask, you will be punished. And so there's so many layers that are at play in silence. But maybe you could talk to me about what is silence interpreted as in maybe more of the mainstream culture, in the American culture when you're silent in the middle of a negotiation.
So there's a couple of things. I feel like the really advanced negotiators, people who understand the power of silence, will use it as a tool, right? Because people who are not as advanced may not understand the power of silence. And let me just talk a little bit about what I mean when I say the power of silence. So in our American culture, people are afraid of silence. So if you are an advanced negotiator and you know this, you use that to your own advantage by keeping silent and then allowing the other people to jump in, right? It's the same thing when you're doing sales calls. People are so afraid of silence that they continue to talk when they're trying to close. And I'm like, no, 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 just be quiet. Just
I'm
pause.
going to give a hearty amen to that as someone that works very closely to sales, but I'm sorry, carry on, continue.
Yes. Just like pause because you need the other person to have time to reflect and
Yes,
time to think. But
yes.
we're so afraid of that people have a tendency to continue talking and talking and talking because they're afraid of silence. So if you know that psychologically, then you can use that to your advantage by just holding the silence.
Yeah.
Now, to another, speaking to another, a scenario is that I see frequently in negotiations during mediations. It's not so much that it's being used to their advantage, but sometimes there's so much anger, they can't even speak. So they just sit there and they're fuming. You can literally see smoke coming out of their ears, and they're sitting there in silence. And so that silence speaks a different kind of volume, which is how angry is this person that they can't even speak,
Yeah, yeah.
you know? What have you seen?
I mean, so I think your ability to sort of dissect what is behind silence minimally reveals that silence is not disengagement.
Correct.
It could actually reflect a very high level of engagement. And I think that's something that we have to be very cautious of as we negotiate and we mediate, right? That we become very practiced in the suspension of assumptions because there's so many ways that silence could be reading or reflecting, a lot of what is actually underlying. I think in my context, because I am much more of a corporate citizen, if you will, in some of the silences that the maybe more common interpretation of the silence is lack of engagement, and more of a sense of like that they're not as interested. And so earlier when you're talking about the sales dynamic and that is I think really much more of the trending that I see. And so this is why I think this topic is very close to heart for me because in high context relationships, silence is there's so many layers to it, right?
Well, you can also use silence not just to like in the sales context, but you can also use silence to slow down a conversation, especially if it is heated. And I always tell people, if you're not ready to respond, don't respond.
Yeah.
Just wait, right? So you can take 2 or 3 or 4, 10 seconds before you respond. We're not accustomed to doing that. Typically, we're finding ourselves in escalating conversations if it's, a conflict. But if you want to learn de-escalation skills for oneself when you are in a potential, like all of a sudden, right, everything's going fine, suddenly someone says something to you, you find like, oh my gosh, I'm blindsided, I'm really angry. If you want to slow down the pace, using silence to help you slow it down is a very, very effective way to de-escalate things by just taking more pauses in between the responses.
And I think that's actually something that we as mediators can give to our clients as a gift, right? Giving them permission to sit in their silence and to maybe diffuse a lot of the emotions that they're feeling and give them the space to process before they come back in and are sort of ready to engage in direct communications with the other side.
Oh, absolutely. And I think also as mediators, we need to be okay holding that silence for them. meaning that we as mediators should not necessarily jump in to fill the silence.
Yep. Yep. It's sort of like, when you go out and have lunch with a friend and there's sort of like a lull in the conversation, and, that silence could be filled with, oh, they don't want to talk anymore, are they ready to leave, or they find I'm boring. And sometimes you just sort of have to trust in the strength of the relationship, that it can just be quiet for a while and it doesn't have to read as rejection or all these other things, right? So there's totally a whole bunch of parallels. So I think
Right.
what you're saying.
Or even like viewing it as, oh my gosh, Ellen and I have just run out of things to say to one another,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then people don't want to give that message, so they just fill the space.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I love to like switch a paradigm just by like sort of shifting it. I think that's what the magic of being a mediator is, to be able to like just shift paradigms, right? And so I would love to shift that paradigm by saying, instead of thinking of it as a moment in time where, oh my gosh, we've run out of things to talk about, it should be looked upon as, I'm so comfortable with Ellen that this silence between us, this momentary silence, however long it lasts, is comfortable. Like, I'm so good with you
Yes.
that we can comfortably sit in silence,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
To be able to think of it that, like, I know that when I'm with my family, right, we're close. And if all of a sudden there's like lulls in our conversation, it's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. The moment isn't, it's just silence, but it isn't filled necessarily with, anxiety or any of those other things that we might attribute in other contexts that may feel a little bit more high stakes, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, totally agree with what you're saying. So if I could ask you another question, Alice, how are you able to kind of morph, I guess, if you will, as you're doing mediations across cultures, or as you're kind of understanding the unspoken background of what folks are bringing into the space, even when it comes to, say, silence or different relational dynamics that are not stated per se. Like, how do you negotiate that for yourself?
So I love this topic because it is a very interesting one. And I'm going to give you an answer, but it's not the easy answer, right? It's not like, oh, we'll just read this book or just give, right? My answer to that, and it's what I've done my whole life, is to as a mediator, you should expose yourself to as many cultures as possible just in your regular time and life. The more you can be with other cultures, the more you can sync with their sort of vibe and way
Yeah,
of
yeah,
being and languaging and way of seeing the world. And so if you can do that, then you can mediate with more and more like different cultures, because you're like, oh, I get you. I see you. I
yeah.
understand what's going on. And it's the same whether it's international cultures or with even subcultures within the United States,
Totally, totally.
right? If you are from New York and you've never spent any time with a Southerner, and you're suddenly going to be mediating, there's going to be potentially some discomfort, and that discomfort shows up.
Yeah,
Like, they're going to tell, and then suddenly they are no longer comfortable using you as the mediator because there's some level of discomfort. However, if you spend a lot of time in the South and you live in New York and you're like, oh yeah, I totally know how they are. I know they're much, how different they are from the people in New York, and you show up, then you suddenly start, you're like a chameleon in some ways.
yes, yes, completely.
It's very subtle. It's not like a really overt shift, but it's subtle enough that you know how to make the all the different people who are you're working with comfortable in your presence.
Totally. I mean, I think two things. One of the joys of being a mediator is really being able to establish quick rapport with your clients, right? And really build that
Yes.
relationship of trust so that you can walk them through a very emotionally fraught process, right? But I
Yes.
think the second joy is that we are in the business of constantly uprooting assumptions, both for other people, but I think touching on what you're saying is foremost for ourselves, right? In terms of how different cultures see one another, how different people assume interactions ought to be, right? And so it's sort of like, as we're doing our craft, we're in this lab where we have a hypothesis as to this is how people are thinking other people relate. And then as we have further conversations, or as we establish that relationship of trust, we get to uproot that assumption. And that process for me is so fun. It's so fun.
Yeah.
And also just makes you appreciate different people and their stories and where they're coming from, you know?
And
So,
I
yeah.
think too, like the ground rules that mediators usually put out, right? Are those are especially helpful when there's high context mediations going on, when you're dealing with different, because you want to make sure that we're all on the same page, right? One of the most important things I do is I ask people like, hey, is it okay if we go by first names? Is there anyone that would prefer to be called by something else? Because that way, if someone gives you permission to say, Ellen, it's fine to call me Alice, you can call me by my first name, then it's different than if you just show up and presume
Yes.
it's okay to call me Alice, because then I can be offended,
Yes. Yes.
right? And then once I'm offended, now it's harder for me to hear you and listen to you because I'm in my head already about how I
Yeah.
feel like you're super rude or insensitive. And so that's blocking my ability to hear you clearly in a negotiation.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
So,
also creating a bias against you.
totally. And it's this intentionality, excuse me, it's intentionality in giving people permission at
Yes.
different points, right? To have
Yes.
that kind of conversation or relate to the person in that kind of way. Because especially in tense conversations, people don't come to mediation because they're getting along with the other party, right? We know that. We need to really establish the ground rules of how we are going to react and how we are going to interact, right? So
Yes.
I love everything that you're saying. In what seems to be a very simple question, or like, you can call me Alice, actually has so many layers behind it.
It does,
Yeah. So
right?
that's beautiful. That's so beautiful.
And even, like you said, in some, not all cultures are as direct as we are here in the United States, right? A lot of times it's like you said, the unspoken is really, so you have to also be really good at reading subtext. And I feel like for myself, because I have a background in theater, we're constantly trained as actors to read subtext. What's the
Yes.
subtext? I mean, like we get questioned on that when we're studying roles. What's your subtext here? What's your subtext here?
Yeah.
Subtext is always something completely different than what is written on the page, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not written. And so as expert negotiators, as expert mediators, we all need to practice reading subtext.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And actually, just to piggyback off of your acting background, I think what's another fascinating observation is that there are many actors that go into executive coaching and how to have executive presence. And I think a more direct way of saying that is they're trained in teaching how to act the part
Yes,
in the corporate world, right? And clearly, acting the part looks like something very specific, right?
exactly.
And so, totally, there's so much subtext in all of our relationships, but especially in a mediation or negotiation where everyone has a very specific part to play, right?
Exactly, exactly. And so a lot of times I will, another thing that's really good is really good to give, whether it's each other or if you are the mediator, your clients, right? Tools to be able to manage the mediation appropriately for them. Meaning, frequently I will say, look, if you are feeling any of these negative emotions, I'll give a list of like 7 or 8 different emotions. Or if you are feeling any of these negative physical attributes, like shallow breathing, your heart is racing, you're having a headache, your temples are pounding, right? I give them all of these. I say, all you have to do is just say, Alice, it's time to go into breakout rooms. Like it's literally that. It works very, very effectively because now I've given them a tool.
Yep. Yep.
I've given them a list of symptoms and I give them the tool to handle it.
Yeah.
And so if you're able to do that in a negotiation to say, hey, let's come to these agreements. If anyone calls for a break, that we honor that and we take a 5-minute break as long as we honor coming back to the conversation, right? Or whatever those asks are, to set them up clearly, especially when you have high context negotiations, because you have to have some kind of common language.
Totally. And again, I think it seems simple, but again, there's so much intentionality behind and also benefit because for some people, when they're feeling those symptoms, they may not attribute it to, okay, this conversation is actually quickly going to go south. They may
Right.
actually interpret it as I am having an even more killer point here, and I'm about to slam dunk this negotiation, right? And so in our role as mediators, we're kind of giving a quick timeout, and we're
Yep.
ensuring that the process is going to be honored to the benefit of both parties, right? And so
Exactly.
especially when you're in high emotion, your ability to kind of rationally decipher, what is the best path forward is obviously going to be clouded. So yeah, I mean, I know in other contexts, right? It's like, oh, I'm experiencing like a rash. That must mean I'm having an allergic reaction, but it could be actually you have so much stress in your life,
Yep.
right? That's what the rash is, not because you ate something funny for breakfast. And so I think in a similar way, when folks are in the heart of the heat, right, emotionally, they may not recognize that that actually means that they need to step out of maybe the joint session, right,
Yes.
to just have
Yes.
some private time with Alice. So yeah,
Yes.
no, that's so beautiful.
And I also let people know that as the mediator, if I'm noticing high emotion or if I notice that people are hitting an impasse, that I will go into breakout rooms. Now, setting that expectation goes a long way
Hmm.
because when you set the expectation and then you deliver, no one is going to question you about it. If you
Hmm.
forget to set that expectation and you only say, oh, either one of you can call for a breakout room and we move into the mediation, and suddenly I go, hey, we need to go into a breakout room, someone can call me on it and say, hey, Alice, neither one of us asked for it. Why are you trying to send us into breakout rooms? So it can go sideways if
Yeah,
you don't
yeah.
set up, properly, right?
Well, I'm also curious when you are maybe meeting between a party that's from a very high context culture versus a low context culture. Are you doing some pre work, in your private sessions with them, kind of educating them on like, this is how they're seeing it,
Yes.
and the more that you talk in this direction, it is going to be poorly received. Like, how much of that coaching are you doing front end throughout? Just how do you approach that tactically, I guess?
Yeah, so depending on the situation, I have done many, many times, I've done pre-work with people, right? And that pre-work looks like a couple of different things. It looks like me trying to help them negotiate in a very clear and effective way. Sometimes people aren't 100% clear about exactly what they want. They want something, but then you say, what is that exact thing? And they'll say, I don't know, whatever's fair. And I'm like, okay, that is not clear. Whatever's fair is not clear. So I help them sort of hone in on like what are some resolutions that look okay to you. Because a lot of times people are embroiled in conflict, but when you ask them what would you accept as a resolution, they may not initially have an answer.
Mm-hmm.
They're just so consumed by the
Yeah,
conflict,
yeah.
right? And so I ask them, let's think through some possible acceptable resolutions that you might
Mm-hmm.
offer or counter offer, right? And then also I will maybe talk about, well, the other side is going to say this, or this is where the other side is feeling. So I also want them to be able to approach the the point of conflict appropriately, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes people are in conflict with one another and they may not know some information.
Yeah.
We don't want anyone to get blindsided. If you get blindsided, you can't think again.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I want them to be prepared. Okay, this is what the talking points are from the other side. I want you to be prepared to address these talking points.
Totally, totally. Um, One more question for you. Since you come from a high context culture, right?
Yep.
Obviously, you're very fluent in many cultures and you have been intentional about immersing yourself in other worlds, and
Yep.
obviously successfully so because you mediate these very cases. What was the journey like for you to kind of become fluent in a new speak, but also to set aside maybe some of the practices or the values that really you were swimming in?
So, thank you for asking that question. I love that question. I've had a bit of a longer journey, right? And I would say when I first started mediating, I started mediating with au pairs and host families. Au pairs, for those listeners who are not clear about what that is, those are people who are live-in child caregivers and they come from a different country. So already I'm dealing with cross-cultural issues constantly, right? Because the families are all like local. They're not necessarily all American, a lot of them could be immigrants that have moved here, right? So now sometimes there could, if they are immigrant that moved here, now we're dealing with multiple cultures, right? Because we've got the American culture, we've got wherever they came from, and then wherever their au pair came from. And so I was having to mediate a lot of times, like international or interculturally. So that's where I started my mediation. But prior to that, I spent 3 years in the Czech Republic, immersing myself in their language, in their culture, and all of that. So then I really understood, you know, what a Czech person, how they thought, how they react, how they think about things, right? So as I go on through my life, I'm constantly trying to be with people who are not like me.
So what was your initial response? Maybe I'm not very familiar with Czech culture, but that as that against the backdrop of your Japanese heritage, like where you're like, what? Like
Well, it's a very different language. It sounds more like Russian. It's a Slavic language.
yeah,
So
yeah,
it was very, very different from Japanese. And
yeah.
I'm conversationally fluent in Japanese. And then I became fluent in Czech. So I became more fluent in Czech than I was in Japanese because I could speak totally fluently. It's been a bit of time. It's been about 30 years since I've been there. But I would say one of the biggest surprises to me at that time was that there was like open racism against the Romani culture. They're like, oh yeah, we hate gypsies. And I was like, it took me aback
Yeah.
because I had not experienced this sort of thing where people just openly stated it in like places like the university classroom.
It's like you could think it, but definitely don't say it. Right?
Yeah, I know. I was just like, what's happening here? Like people are just saying it out loud in the middle of class and everyone else is agreeing with them saying, yeah, we hate them too. And I was like, oh my goodness. So that was a little bit of a startling surprise for me
Yeah.
when I went there. But I really enjoyed being there. I look different. There are not that many Asians in the Czech Republic. So it was mainly white people and then me. And then there were some Vietnamese people, but you never saw them out and about in the town. The Vietnamese people were usually the open market, like vendors. So for some reason, I only saw them at the markets. And I was like, I don't know where they go all the rest of the day because, like, you don't see them in the grocery store. Like, I had no idea what was going on. But yeah, so that was interesting. I was in a small town.
Yeah.
And word got around that there was one Asian woman there. So usually people knew who I was before I ever met them
Wow.
because they all were like, "Oh yeah, there's a woman named Alice." You can tell because she's an Asian woman.
Wow. Wow.
So yeah, the other thing I want to talk about too regarding negotiation is that no matter how good people are at negotiations, even me, even you, right? Even all of the once emotions come in,
Yeah.
it is so difficult to see what the heck you're trying to do.
Yeah. I mean, I
When you
think.
find that?
Yeah. I mean, I think we'd like to hope that people act rationally, especially in negotiations. But as you and I know, that's very far from the truth. And so many times, you sort of do like a post eval, and you're like, could it have gone there? Could it have gone that way? And it's because, exactly to your point, as emotions get involved, things change. And I know in a prior conversation we were talking about how some folks enjoy conflict, right? There's high conflict loving individuals, and they actually like to be embroiled in conflict. And maybe to you and I, that doesn't seem rational, but it's definitely a motivator for some individuals. And so, yeah, I think we're constantly in the business of a suspending assumptions, because once emotions get into the mix, it's while there are certainly patterns that happen, it's not predictable at all. In a way that ration and logic may be more predictable.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I have worked with executives who come to me and they say, look, I need help with this personal negotiation, even though I negotiate day in and day out, and my job is to negotiate. The minute it becomes super personal, it's much harder to see the forest for the trees because your emotions start to cloud your judgment.
Yeah, yeah,
And so I think people just need to be aware of that. Be aware when you're negotiating, be aware when your emotions are like getting the best of you, because that is the point in time where you need to disengage at least temporarily. And sometimes it's difficult. If it's a divorce, no matter how many times you disengage, the minute you start talking about it, you start to feel
Yeah.
emotional again. So it is not easy to keep your emotions at bay, even if you are to take a break sometimes,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And I think that that's also where we as, neutrals, emphasis on the, neutrals, can really support our clients at those high stakes moments, right? Because like we can be that person that gives you a path forward. We can be that calm presence that is going to walk you through a process that's going to see you to a solution that both parties are going to be happier with. But we receive people at that high emotion point, and so
Yes.
yeah, it's a very specific point in people's lives, that we get to start off the conversation, so to speak.
Well, I also want to, you mentioned like, we show up to be the calmness in the storm, right? And from a theater perspective, I love talking about energy. So when you're watching a play or a movie, you're receiving whatever energy the actors are on, in the movie are projecting. Like you can cry if they're sad. All of a sudden, that sad energy wave comes over you like a wave, and you might find yourself crying in the middle of a movie.
Wow.
You might be sitting on the edge of your seat if you're watching an action flick. So energy, even if it's on screen, is transferable to other people. And so you want to make sure when you show up as a negotiator that you're going to transfer calm energy to the other person so they can think through appropriately. If you show up and you say, I'm going to be a bully, I'm going to bully them to get what I want. It may work, but I always say if you are a bully and you got what you got to some kind of resolution, my comeback to that is you probably didn't get the best of what you could have gotten. You probably could have done better,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Because you want to use your energy levels, your calm energy, your gentle energy, your firm energy, whatever positive energy, you want to use that to influence the other person. Like 70% of communication is nonverbal, even not
Yeah.
even in
Yeah.
high context, just generally, right? And so you want to make sure that you are bringing the 70% of the nonverbal communication that is going to help you get what you want.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we hold that calm presence and sort of emitting energy. We hold it at attention because while we want to be that calm presence, we also have to gain sort of the trust of each of our parties. And when they're deep in their emotion, they want some validation, right? And
Yep.
so we want to hear them. We want to respect the place that they're coming from. We also want to maintain neutrality as much as we can, right?
Yep.
And be that calm presence. But sometimes, we to a certain extent do have to feel what they're feeling. And so it's totally what you're saying about, in acting, right? Like the energy that the actor brings, the audience receives.
Yes.
And so we receive it to an extent, but we're always cautious, or not cautious, but always cognizant of maintaining a certain neutrality so that we can be seen by both sides as bringing them through a clear process.
Yes. And, also we as mediators need to be aware if we have certain triggers
That's right. That's totally correct.
because we can't be totally neutral if we're getting triggered by something that someone is doing,
That's right. That's completely on point.
right? So I'm curious, Ellen, if you've ever had that happen to you, and if so, how did you handle it?
I mean, I think I can't. I'm trying to think of a specific scenario. But yeah. Sometimes I think I'm always for the underdog. I think that's probably a lot of people's disposition. They're for the underdog. But I think it's really what you said earlier, in that you actually have to be even better about suspending your own emotions, right? So to the extent that you're giving people permission to have that space, you need to be doing it for yourself, even ahead of them,
Yep.
right? And because the moment that you become too embroiled emotionally, you're also going to lose the trust of the other party that's
Absolutely.
feeling like you're siding with them, right? And
Absolutely.
so I heard it say that being a mediator makes you a better person, in the sense that you have to constantly be self-evaluating and reflecting on what are your own biases that are preventing you from being neutral, and learning to really intentionally cast those aside as you're doing your work. And so there's a lot of self-reflection that's involved, and there's also like a constant check on your own emotional pulse, because you can't be so tied to your own that you're not able
Right.
to read the subtext in the room, like you were saying earlier.
Exactly. I mean, I feel like it helps if you are naturally not a judgmental person. If you have a tendency to be judgmental, then it's a little bit harder because you kind of have to tamp that down a bit.
Yeah, you got to do more pre-work on yourself.
Yes. Yes, definitely. But, luckily I grew up in a way that my father, who's recently passed, was very, very judgmental. And so I made a very conscious decision early in my life. Like,
Yeah,
I don't want to be like that.
yeah,
So I went in the very extreme other direction to try to say I'm going to be open-hearted and non-judgmental,
yeah,
like in my regular life.
yes,
And so therefore, when I moved into the mediation sphere, it was a little bit easier because I didn't have these triggers where I'm judging someone or something that someone is doing is making me feel offended, like I can't believe they did that kind of stuff, right?
yeah,
But
yeah,
still, you still have to be aware, oh, this is like making me annoyed, or this is upsetting me, or I feel like this person is wrong. You have to be mindful of all of those things, and then you have to shut them down.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I'll say similar story to you in terms of wanting to steer on the other and given my upbringing, but also once I became aware that there's another way to perceive a situation, then that sort of like opened the floodgates for me, like intellectually, that there's so many ways that this one act could be perceived, and so it sort of just becomes an intellectual exercise to a certain extent of like how is this person receiving this, and maybe what are the chances that their background, whether high context, low context, is informing the way that they're receiving it. And sometimes your hypothesis is exactly off because you're carrying assumptions that you have not yet have been uprooted for you, right? And so it's just this ongoing process of like untangling and uprooting. So it's such a joyful journey, I would say. As you kind of understand better and better how people think and
Yeah.
what people are motivated by, and just the very individual stories that they bring into a very particular conversation. So, yeah.
And there's one more thing I wanted to mention too, because I'm sort of like thinking about it when you're talking about the conversations that you have with people, is that we all have filters and we
Mm-hmm.
listen through those filters,
That's correct. That's yeah.
right? So if we feel like we have a spouse who is uber critical about what we do, then every single thing that spouse says, we're listening through a filter that is oh, my spouse is very critical of what I do filter, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so then even a neutral statement can come across because we're receiving information
Yep.
through those filters. And so those filters typically go up when you're like in a relationship with someone, whether it's a spouse or a parent or a child or, someone close. It doesn't necessarily happen. It could happen, I guess, with colleagues at work if you're working with them on a day to day. Like, let's say
Mm-hmm.
you and I work together and I perceive, you never told me, but I'm perceiving that you don't like me. Now
Mm-hmm.
I have a filter that is receiving information always through the Ellen does not like me filter.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
even if you say something like, oh, did you go get that coffee? I'm going to hear it in a way that I'm perceiving it in a negative light. And so it's really important to know this when you negotiate,
Yeah.
because if anyone has a filter, that communication is not being delivered effectively or clearly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll say that sometimes those filters are so unforgiving, right? Like once that filter is on, and Alice thinks Ellen doesn't like her, it's just like we
Yeah.
can't really communicate.
Yes.
We can't really communicate, and I mean that's where a mediator comes in, and knowing when you need to bring in a third party to correct or just increase the level of communication that is possible.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I say the same thing too with like losing trust.
Yeah.
Once there's no trust, when you say, okay, I'll bring you the money tomorrow, I'm like, well, I don't trust her. I
Mm-hmm.
don't think that,
Mm-hmm.
you know what I mean? And suddenly,
Yeah.
like, we're spiraling because, like, it's,
Yeah. Yeah.
so I've seen a lot of that as well, where once trust is broken, it's very, very difficult to have clear communication because no matter what you say, I'll be like, oh, she's lying. She's not telling the truth. I don't
Yeah.
trust her. She's trying to get one over on me. Like, all of these, like, messages are
Mm-hmm.
blocking any kind of good intention coming from you.
Totally. Totally. Um, what success have you had in course correcting?
I would say the most important thing in course correcting something where trust has been broken is tenacity. Tenacity in like sticking with it till we can, like, you're planting the seed and sticking with it and watering it. You don't see any shoots coming out yet, right? And let's say it's going to take 3 days for this plant. Well, in real life, the trust might be like several weeks or several months.
Yeah.
But if you abruptly say, this isn't working, I want to leave because it's taking too long, that is what's going to break the trust or continue to have it be broken, right?
Yeah.
But if you just say, okay, I don't trust you, Ellen. Ellen, you say, I don't trust you, Alice, and we agree to try to work together, you have to have patience. You absolutely have to have patience. When I see it not course correcting is when people give up prematurely.
Yeah.
When they say, I'm too tired to do this is too much work, you're not worth it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Or even maybe like, hey, I'd rather engage in conflict with you because that is what I know and it feels comfortable. And to something that you said earlier where people like conflict, I don't think anyone necessarily consciously chooses conflict. It is a subconscious thing. So I don't want people thinking like, well, I would never choose it. No, you just like, as much as you hate it, it is what you know.
Yeah.
And sometimes what you know is better than what you don't know.
That's that is that is such a profound observation. We need to bottle that up somewhere. We need to bottle.
But right, isn't it
It's
correct?
so true. It's so true. And I think what you said also just sort of gives a note of hope in conflict, because I think when folks are engaging a mediator, they're kind of already on the cusp of giving up, right? This is for them sort of like a last resort.
Yep.
And I think, I guess if we're in the business of conflict resolution, right, conflict can be an opportunity to engage, right? And it isn't necessarily like a hopeless situation. And to your point, with that tenacity, with that kind of commitment and patience, something new that is good can form, but it does take that tenacity. And sometimes that's what we do. We say, hold on a little bit longer. Trust me in this process.
Yep.
We can untangle this conversation. Just, hold on. And a lot of times our clients are running on the edge of giving up. And we really need to leverage the rapport that we've built with them, the trust that we as mediators have built with them to say, hold my hand. We're going to walk a little further. And the joy is in seeing a settlement, right?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And I implore people, if they are in a position where they're in a conflict and they're about to give up, saying like it's not worth it, I'm never going to get the trust back. I would love to just have you ask yourself, why am I walking away before we can rebuild trust? Is it because the relationship isn't worth it, or is it because you're afraid of what would happen if you actually rebuilt the trust? Because if you can hang in there long enough, you can rebuild it. Most people I see, when they're saying, oh, I don't trust them, both parties are not bad, right? They're both like decent people. It's just that something happened and trust was broken. So it's not like we're dealing with one evil person
Yeah.
and one good person. Typically, it's two flawed human beings,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I always want people to ask themselves, if you're going to walk away prematurely before you rebuild the trust, what are you afraid of?
Yeah. I like that. It's two flawed people. I mean, they still make those flawed people, right? So,
We're all flawed,
yeah,
right?
exactly. So the conflict is bound to happen. And yeah, I've heard it said, you only need two people to have a conflict. And I would say, actually, in my career coaching, you only need one person.
Yes. You only need one person. It's true. I mean, like, just to give you an example of that, well, people can always obviously have conflict within themselves. But even let's say that you're a really nice person and I decide I'm going to create conflict in Ellen's life. Even if you do everything right, I can just mess up your life just by showing up and doing all these bad things to you, right? And so that one person would be me. And I can cause conflict, even though you're like, I'm doing my best to work with you, Alice. Like, I'm trying to get along with you. I can cause all the conflict completely by myself.
Yeah, yeah. And I think a close cousin to that is just the internal conflict that we have, right? And so many of my career coaching conversations is like, I've always wanted to be this creative, but then my parents are telling me I need to get into this technical degree, right?
Yep.
And so it's like, you need to give yourself permission to accept a certain level of conflict and to actually chart your path forward, right? So there's so many levels, so many layers, within one person, but also, as we layer on more parties and different interests, all that. But yeah.
We could go on and on. I know Ellen and I have lovely conversations and we could talk for hours, but I really enjoyed our conversation today, Ellen. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me, Alice. Like you said, we could go on and on.
Yeah. And Ellen, if anyone wanted to work with you or get in touch with you, what is the best way for them to find you?
The best way for them is just to connect with me on LinkedIn, and we'll take it from there.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, listeners, for joining in once again for another episode of Negotiation with Alice. Until next time.